started. So you guys know Patrick, so I'm going to let him just take it away.
Nice intro.
Yes. Well, I need no intro, right? Yes, she is right. As she was saying, I am Patrick. I work in News and Media Relations. You all know that already. So thank you, first of all, for all coming. And thank you all to you downstairs as well. Yay! I love this thing. I know if any of your schedules are anything like ours, I know this time of year is absolutely bonkers. So I really do appreciate you all coming out and giving me the opportunity to talk about something that I care deeply about, which is me, obviously. Anyway, with that said, so I started here at Fordham in 2007, and I had thought about getting a master's degree when I started here because that's something you can do. And I never really knew what I wanted to do. Nothing really appealed to me too much. But in 2009, I was very fortunate in that the Urban Studies program was launched. Actually, the Urban Studies program had already been around since the 60s, but the master's program was launched. And so I knew that would be something I would be interested in because I love cities. And I also knew it was a multidisciplinary program, so I could take things like sociology and history and political science and economics and just always find something different to get into. So in 2009, in the fall, I found myself in Intro to Urban Studies with Rosemary Wakeman, who then was the head of the program, along with 7 other students. We were the inaugural cohort, I think is the term. So I got to take classes like Maritime New York. This was something where I got to study the Gowanus Canal. The Death and Life of the American Suburb, which focused in particular in this case on Hastings-on-Hudson, if you're familiar with up the Hudson River. And I got to take classes that were about topics such as uncontrolled urban growth, gentrification, and the roles of cities in a globalized world. And in the master's program, as I said, the Urban Studies program had already been around since the 60s. The master's program had come out in 2009. It's a lot smaller. It actually went on hiatus in 2015, came back in 2016, and is still around now. And in fact, right now, they're having sort of their big event. My colleague Tom is covering it. They're having a 2-day conference at Lincoln Center. It's a joint conference, I believe, with Columbia and NYU. So it's kind of a good day to be doing something urban studies related, ironically. And in fact, one of the people who is presenting there is one of the people who was in my inaugural cohort. This goes to show you that things are really happening. David Goodwin, who's a law librarian, excuse me, he actually, like me, turned his thesis into a book that was actually published by Fordham University Press. He's presenting down there, I think, in about an hour. So, when you do the Urban Studies Masters, you have to do a thesis. I chose to do graffiti. I didn't really want to do anything like this. I knew already going in that a lot had already been done on it. And obviously when you do these sorts of things, you want to focus on things that have not been done before. So what I wanted to focus on was the kind of art that really is super complicated and will stop you in your tracks as you're walking down the sidewalk, like that. And that. And that. That's actually in the Bronx, for what it's worth, very close to the Bronx Museum of Art, just a couple blocks from Yankee Stadium. And that's probably one of my favorite pictures. Kind of funky with the, focus and such. So I basically started from the idea that these things are awesome, and I want more of them. And I want to find out how they're made and how we can get more of them done. So I started with 5 points. If you don't know 5 points, it used to be a about 6-story industrial building that was alongside the 7 train in Long Island City. You used to be able to see it as the 7 train would loop around. And I knew it was there because I'd taken the 7, and I thought, all right, I'll go there. It's an easy enough place to start. And they have things like this. Yeah, right. So I knew I was onto something really good because one of the first times I went there, I just stumbled into this group of people who showed up to paint the logo Rico. They did graffiti of Rico on the wall. They painted the guy who was the curator of 5 Points to let them do that. So they were really, I guess they were so smitten with this idea. So I was like, okay, something's going on here. And it's a good thing I did too, because if you may know that in 2014, 5 Points was whitewashed and demolished by its owner. Interesting side note, the artists who had painted the stuff there and then had it all washed off sued the guy who owned the building. And just this past, I think it was February, they won a $6.7 million settlement, a judgment against him. This is a really big deal, and it's actually going to probably have a lot of effects on the art world going forward for reasons that I'm happy to talk about after this if you're interested. So, yeah, sorry, it's a little pixelated. It looks a lot better here. So when you write a thesis, you probably all know this, right? Because you work at a university. You can't just write about stuff you find out. Like, you actually have to make a point and back it up with a theoretical framework. This is the hardest part for me, was the theory. I'm much easier at just gathering stuff and telling stories. So Dr. Wakeman steered me to this guy, David Harvey, who wrote this book called Rebel Cities in 2012. He's a Marxist scholar, which it dawns on me, this is May 1st, May Day. So good day to be talking about Marxist theoretical frameworks, right? So I ended up studying this book at length. And I just want to read you a real quick section, bear with me, to give you an idea of where we're going with this. In Rebel Cities, Marxist scholar David Harvey writes that capitalism, as practiced in the United States, is predicated on the notion that as profits are earned, they must constantly be reinvested in opportunities elsewhere before a competitor invests in that next opportunity first. Okay? Capitalism rests, as Marx tells us, upon the perpetual search for surplus value, or profit. But to produce surplus value, capitalists have to produce a surplus product. This means that capitalism is perpetually producing the surplus product that urbanization requires. We all with me here, or did that just totally fly over everybody's heads? Okay. In New York City, this surplus value is manifested most intensely in the real estate market. So the idea was that if you want to understand the motivations of people who turn over their property to graffiti writers to do these kinds of murals, and why the city of New York spends millions of dollars erasing the bad kind of graffiti, it helps to know where real estate fits in New York City, which is, you know, it's the shining beacon of capitalism in the United States. The other thing that I got into as part of the theoretical framework, and there were a lot more, there's lots more to it, but I'm kind of condensing it a bit, is something called symbolic interactionism, which is a great master's thesis kind of term, right? So that's the theory that people interact with each other by interpreting or defining each other's actions instead of merely reacting to each other's actions. So there's a bit of going on there before you just interact with something. So this is what I wrote, and this is the last quote I'll read you. There is strong evidence that when it comes to graffiti murals, works composed with paintbrushes are interpreted by the general public as art, whereas identical pieces done with spray cans and markers are equated with vandalism, regardless of their legality. The meanings that the public ascribes to murals differ a great deal from the meanings it assigns to graffiti not affiliated with murals. So basically, there exists this idea that this and this, by the way, I just want to back up for a second because I love this, if you missed it. I love that. Be kind. Be kind. You might miss that, right? So that and that will inevitably lead to that. Not so good. So, as part of the broken windows theory of policing that New York City officially has adopted. The way it works is this: they aggressively erase all the stuff that's considered vandalism. So what you can do is, if you were to see something like this, and you said, I don't like that, you call 311, you file a complaint. What the city will do is they will track down the owner, I mean that's a gate, but you know, of the building or whatever, and they'll send them a note and they'll say, hey, you got to get rid of this, you got to tell us what you're going to do with it. And the owner can do one of two things. They can either respond and say, hey, I like that, that's awesome, leave it alone. Or they can say, okay, fine, I'll clean it off. Or there's a third option, they can just ignore it. Say, screw it, whatever, I'm not paying attention to you. And if that happens, then a certain amount of time goes by, and the city will then put you in a system, and then after a certain time after that, they will send out a crew, and they'll buff it whether or not you want them to, whether or not you give them permission to. The system is set up so that it's an opt-out, not an opt-in kind of thing. So they don't have to get explicit permission, and you can end up with that kind of lovely thing, right? So that's a buff building. Pretty good, you know. They tried to stick to the color, sort of. Not entirely, though. So what I set out to do with the book was basically prove that graffiti murals, like the ones you saw before at 5 points, are far and away superior to not only the stuff that you think of as vandalism, but also this. So we're thinking, to do the book, or to do the thesis rather, I'm getting ahead of myself, to do the thesis, I visited Bushwick in Brooklyn, Inwood in Manhattan, Hunts Point in the Bronx, New West Brighton in Staten Island. That was a tough one. Trying to find where you can get where you can find graffiti and graffiti murals in Staten Island I was very happy I found that, even if it does look a little different. And then, because I was told by Dr. Wakeman that I can't just stick to the 5 boroughs, I actually ventured across the river to Jersey City, where I found the whale that became the cover of the book. And then, because I just couldn't stop myself, I went to Trenton as well and caught some stuff being done in action. So what I did was I interviewed the building owners, I interviewed the artists. If there were any middlemen who connected the two of them together, I interviewed them. And then I just interviewed random people that were walking by, which is a little hard to do in some places like Hunts Point, but I found some people to talk to. I went and I interviewed the folks at Groundswell, which is a local traditional kind of mural making group here in the city. They do things like this. That's on the back of a wall of a jail in downtown Brooklyn. And I interviewed the spokesperson from Philadelphia Mural Arts. Some of you may know this, but if you don't, Philadelphia Mural Arts is really the gold standard for this kind of thing. Everybody around the country looks to them as an example of how to get stuff like this done. A lot of what they do I didn't find to be particularly applicable to New York, because New York's just New York, but there were a lot of lessons that came out of talking to them and the way they go about it and what these can do for the neighborhoods that I found really useful. And I also spoke with the director of the quality of life in the New York City Mayor's Community Affairs Unit. And they're the ones that supervise this army of anti-graffiti workers for a chapter that I called the Clean Slate Club. Why did I put that there? Right. Basically, I don't even remember. Okay. So, right. Based on all these interviews, I came to the conclusion that because the city only offers the option to property owners to either buff tags, you know, the graffiti, the vandalism stuff, or keep it, and they don't offer them the option to hire these artists to do things like this. Now I'm remembering why I put this here. They're really missing out. They're missing out on an opportunity to promote what is essentially a local form of art, and that it actually generates economic activity on its own. I mean, there are tour groups that go around the city to show off street art and graffiti. One of the great quotes that I got from the guy who owned the building in Bushwick, he compared giving artists the opportunity to paint on the side of his building to planting a flower in an alley, which I thought was a great analogy. And then the guy, one of the groups that I interviewed about the Bronx, this guy Nicer from the Tats crew, he had a great quote about what he thought their art did for the communities in the Bronx, particularly in places like Hunts Point. You have mothers who work rigorous jobs, and by the time they get home, their kids are home, and it isn't like they're getting dressed and saying, come on, let's go to the MoMA. Let me show you the difference between a Monet and a Goya. Not everyone in New York City really has that kind of leisure time to partake in the art culture that's out there. The stuff that we're putting out there in these neighborhoods is the modern-day Picassos and Goyas and Monets that bring arts and color to other people's lives. You could debate as to whether or not they're on the level of Monet and Goya, but you kind of get the idea that this is putting this stuff out there in places that normally wouldn't be seen. So that was the thesis. And it took me 5 years, roughly, to get to the point where I was done with the master's, because I was taking one class per semester. And then I had to take another semester off because our daughter, Eliza, was born. I still get a little bit verklempt over it. But I did graduate. There we are, 2015. And she made it. She was able to come. Yeah, good times. Henry, our second, is there as well, but he's a little hidden. So, after 5 years, I had so much stuff. Everybody was saying, all right, you're going to do a book, right? And I'm like, okay, yeah, I guess so, right? I'd never written a book before. I'd written magazine articles and newspaper stories and things like that. I didn't even know anybody who'd ever written a book, which was surprising to me, oddly enough. I didn't know how to go about it. I'd heard, oh, you have to get an agent. How do you get an agent? Well, you have to be published. Okay, well, how do I get published without an agent? Anyway, so what I did was I basically asked all the people who I had talked to in the course of doing the thesis, who do you like? What's a good publisher? And I was recommended Schiffer Press, which is a small outlet outside of Philadelphia. And they're the kind of place that if you own the 400-page encyclopedia of graffiti and you're like, I want more, this is what they do. They do this, it's like the completist kind of thing. For the person who has to have everything about graffiti, they'll do that. It's these sort of small runs and things like that. So they accepted my unsolicited proposal, and on August 28th, 2015, 2 weeks after our son Henry was born, the book came out. Yay! So Schiffer doesn't have a lot of resources. They're a small publisher. They did a good job printing, but they don't have a whole, their publicity person works with like 30 authors or something, so you got to do a lot of it yourself. They did get me this slot at Comic-Con, which was kind of cool, at the Javits Center. First time I'd ever been to Comic-Con. I don't think I sold any books at that, but it was kind of nice. But I did manage to get some good press on my own. I managed to get a story in Huffington Post, City Lab, which is kind of an urban studies kind of blog, did something. Who else did something? A couple other street art blogs, and then the New York Times picked it up. Sam Roberts included the book in a holiday book roundup for if you're looking for books that you want to buy about New York City and you'll give them as a gift. So that was pretty sweet. So Fordham threw me a book release party. I know some of you here in the room were there, so you know how, huh? Janet, I know. This photo is courtesy of Tom Stoker, yeah, and that was kind of amazing experience right over here in the atrium. WFUV interviewed me for Fordham Conversations, and then in December, which was probably the high point, I actually got myself onto live TV, morning show on WPIX. Little stressful having to be in the green room at 7 a.m. And did I mention my son was about a month old at that point? Those of you kids would know how much fun that is. So, anybody want to watch me for 3 minutes?
Yes.
All right. Let's see. Okay.
It's 7:45 now, and the urban art of graffiti has had an influence on music, fashion, film, and all kinds of aspects of culture for many years. All of the major cities around the world, you see beautifully painted graffiti murals splashed across walls and buildings. Well, joining us, actually, take a look at this. This is the Bowery mural, just one of many. Again, these murals are done with permission, mind you. It's important to point that out. Joining us now to talk about graffiti murals is author Patrick Merrill. Good morning to you. And this book, there's the cover there, it's all about graffiti murals. And, you know, I sat there, we started talking, and you seem like a nice guy, and I'm chatting with you, and I'm thinking to myself, you don't seem like Mr. Graffiti. And
Thank
I
you.
sit down and just talk with you. I'm sure I'm not the first person to say this to you.
No.
So how did all this come about?
Well, I needed to write a thesis to get a master's degree in urban studies at Fordham University. And I
Woo,
decided
Fordham.
because a lot of people, I think, like to think that New York is kind of losing some of its character. You know, it's becoming very expensive, and a lot of moms and pop shops are closing. And these murals, I felt, are a really good rejoinder to that notion because they're done by artists. It's an art form that was invented here.
Yeah.
It's become a global art form since then. I mean, people come from all over the world to see these things here in New York. And the best part is, because it's street art, it's free. Anybody can see it, and it's in a lot of neighborhoods where you wouldn't expect to find this kind of art.
You know, we're showing us pictures there from 5 Points, of course, that is what used to be there, now it's
Rest
gone.
in peace, yeah.
Do you think that form of art, is it dying at all, or is it thriving?
It's very much thriving. You know, when I started to think about where I was going to focus on here in New York, the hardest part was trying to figure out where to go first. Okay, do I go to this wall? Do I go to that wall? Do I go to this building? Do I go to that borough?
Yeah.
I mean, if you start to look around for these things, they're just all over the place.
When you talk about the impact that it has on life, you know, you kind of touched on the idea that this really is one of the things that makes the city what it is. I mean, what is it that you love the most about it, having now delved into this world?
Well, I've lived in New York for a long time, and I think like a lot of people, like when I walk around, I kind of have those street blinders on.
Yeah.
You know, like I got to get to where I'm going.
You got things to do.
I got
We're
things
busy,
to
but,
do.
you know.
I got to drop off my laundry. I got to pick up
Yeah.
groceries. I got to pick up my kids. You know, so you're very point A to point B oriented, and I have a short attention span also, so I love being distracted.
Welcome to the club.
Yeah, I love being distracted, and I love it when I can be walking down the street, and I think I know what I'm going to see, and then I see something else, and I just stop. And it just grabs me. And a lot of these ones, many of the ones that I was able to feature in the book are just, you know, they will stop you in your tracks as you're walking along and just go, whoa.
Yeah. And it's important to point out, because I mean, look, there's this graffiti, and then there's what you have here, and again, these are people, corporations, whatever, that are saying, hey, look, do your art here. They're fostering this, and that's the part of the equation.
Yeah, that's a huge part of it, is the collaboration. And not only the collaboration between the building owners and the artists, but also the people who live in the area and walk nearby. I mean, that was something I was very conscious to do, is to find random people and walk by and say, hey, what do you think of this thing?
Yeah.
And get their perspectives on it. And universally, people would say the kind of graffiti that's done, you know, under cover of night, the aerosol art that's considered vandalism, they would not be okay with that.
This is a different thing.
But this they were very, very big on.
Yeah. Patrick, thank you so much for coming in. And again, the book is called Graffiti Murals. You see it there. Download our app. Click on the Morning News tab. We have more information there all about this. Patrick, thank you again, man.
Thank you, sir.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
You're very
hands down the most terrifying thing I've ever done. I mean, you know, huh? I mean, I follow him on Twitter, and I think he follows me. Yeah, that was one of those things. Be careful what you ask for. You know, I had a friend through my old. Okay, stop. Yeah, basically, a guy that I used to know when I worked at AM New York he now works at WPIX, and so when I was, you know, basically looking around, like, who can I hit up for ideas? I thought, well, it's TV. Why not, right? And he passed it on to a producer, and the producer was like, yeah, let's have him on. And I'm like, oh, shit, live TV. Okay, let's do this. So after I had another review in Brooklyn Street Art in 2016, June 2016, things kind of petered out, as they are wont to do. This happens. And so every once in a while, I check WorldCat to see if any new libraries are carrying it. The Metropolitan Museum of Art's library has it. Yay! As does our own library up at Rose Hill. And I still get royalty checks because there's so much money in publishing. I don't know if you can see the number up there. That is for 7 books that I sold. Yeah, and I can get into more of the reason why $4 equals 7 books, if anybody's interested. But it's interesting the way the universe works, because literally as I was preparing for this, I was going to move on to the next slide. And then out of the blue yesterday, I got a tweet that looked like this. This is literally yesterday. Represent Project. They're out of Eton, England. And they apparently found my book through Apple News, which had a story about the Philadelphia Mural Arts Project. And in the references, it referenced my book. And they picked it up and apparently are going to use it. I've literally been emailing with them on Twitter today about they're going to use it for one of their projects. So it's so interesting. I mean, like, I haven't done anything with this. I haven't publicized it, but it's out there. And so it just goes to show, like, again, this is England. It's not like even the United States. So that's kind of interesting, the way the universe works on this kind of thing. So that's pretty cool. Okay, let's go back to the slideshow. Oop, hang on, sorry.
How many copies have you sold total?
I don't know the exact number. If I had to guess, I'd say about maybe 200, 300 maybe. Yeah, yeah. Are we all the way at the back? We are. Oops, okay. Can we, sorry, I didn't realize I was going to do that. This is the fast forward version. Okay. Nope, I went too far. Okay, so the good news is that even though the city of New York still has this policy where they're just all about buffing everything in sight, and they don't really give a lot of credence to the good things that murals can do, there are some city agencies that are on, they get it. The DOT actually is one of them. That, if you probably can recognize, is the subway stop. It's uptown. They're responsible for that, and that's a long tunnel. I think the tunnel goes like a mile in or something like that, and the whole tunnel is filled. You can kind of see going in. The other great example is the 100 Gates project. This started on the Lower East Side, and they have expanded actually to Harlem and Staten Island, and their whole shtick, it was the Lower East Side Business Improvement District, so kind of one of those quasi-government agencies. And they encouraged all these businesses to allow artists to paint on their gates when the gates are down. And the whole idea being, of course, that most graffiti artists will respect this stuff because it's one of their own. This is a guy named Buff Monster. They won't basically tag the stuff that's already had murals on it. So it keeps it clean and makes it look awesome. We've also done some awesome stuff. I don't know if you guys know this. In 2015, Fordham Law hosted Lady Pink. Lady Pink is a very prominent graffiti artist, sort of a pioneer in the sense that she was one of the first women graffiti artists to be out there. And not that far after that, not long after that, excuse me, Mark Street, a professor of visual arts, convinced J.R., who's another prominent street artist, to come to Lincoln Center right down here on the wall, and they took people's pictures and slapped them up on the concrete wall on 60th Street. It lasted about 3 days, but we're not quibbling here. And then last year, Gina, who I wish was here, I would give her a shout out, but we'll tell you about it later. She had the great idea to have Colin Cathcart over here, our professor of architecture, give a tour to students of Bushwick. And I tagged along, and we also got audio, and it's sort of an audio slideshow that you can see on our website. So I've been asked a lot, not so much now, but certainly after it first came out, what are you going to do next? What's going to be Act 2? And I'll be honest, I don't really have one at the moment. It's a lot. My life's a lot different now than it used to be. Most of the field work that I did for this book, I was able to do before Eliza, our oldest daughter, was born. And now we have not only her, but we have Henry, and I have a job. So that pays real money. And, you know. So I don't really I haven't really figured out a way to follow up on this, other than I take lots of pictures of trucks and I put them up on my Instagram. So things like this, the King Bee, Queen Andrea, yeah. There's Biggie.
Are these all done with spray paint?
Yes,
Always done
more or less,
more
yeah,
or less.
yeah. I mean, it's a monkey with a boombox. Come on. What's not to like, right? And I take pictures of my kids in front of graffiti. That's Eliza. When I first started doing this, she kind of didn't really take to it too much. She'd get really annoyed with me because I was making her sit still. And at that age, kids just want to run around, but she's come around to the point where it's getting a little scary. She's a natural, right? And mind you, I never taught her this thing. She came up on her own. And of course, Henry. Yeah, he's real thrilled too, you can tell. I think I've trained them well. And that's it. So, any questions?
Only because we have kids that are the same age. So, and I live in Brooklyn, right on the border of Bed-Stuy and Clinton Hill.
Yeah.
And so on the way to the Y, every day we pass, every weekend we pass no less than 3 murals of Biggie Smalls.
Oh, yeah.
Right, because we're right there on
Yeah,
Bedford.
you're in your Commandante Biggie, right?
And, yes, the one, the crown, the whole, and so my kids are so familiar because we live in this neighborhood full of these beautiful murals. Butts Up is one of their favorites artists that they look for a lot. But it's hard, and I'm curious how you define the difference between vandalism and graffiti, because they'll see the tags and I'll be like, oh no, that's vandalism. Oh, but this is art. And there were a couple of slides you had where even the one you showed of the gate with the barbed wire on top, it was really colorful and had some merit.
Let's see.
But how do you talk about that with your kids about what's art and what isn't? And are the tags art? I mean, would you consider them? They add color. I mean, you know what I'm saying?
I understand the question, and it's something I had thought about a lot, and actually I do get into a little bit in the book. I assume that's the one you're talking about? Yeah. The general answer to that I have settled on, and I think is a good one, is that if somebody says to you, is it art? The answer is always yes. Everything is art. That's not the question to ask. The question is it good art? Because art is in the eye of the beholder, right? And so there are people who know more about this than I do, people who really, really live and breathe this stuff, that will look at this and they can tell you which one of these is good and which one is bad, right? So this one, for instance, okay, that's a bit more curvy, right? It's got a bit more whatever going on. That one there, what is that? That's just like, I could do that, right? So there's clearly no talent involved in that. There's a little bit more here in terms of what you could do, those people are able to do with the spray can. So that's not, and again, these are the kind of debates that go on forever when it comes to the art world. So when I talk to Eliza about this, I think we're not quite to the point where she's really asking those kinds of questions. I think right now she's just sort of, oh, this is Daddy's thing. This is just, what she just sort of associates with me, is that he's just into that kind of thing. We'll just humor him, right? But my way of thinking about it is more that you can pretty much tell, even with a naked guy with no real experience, whether or not the building owner said, go for it, right? Like that. The guys working at China Walk Super Buffet did not invite all these people to come and do this. You know that. You know that instinctively. And mind you, some of these, I think are pretty good too.
Who's the guy that was tagging all the billboards, that when you're up on the BQE you can see, and he climbs, it's a feat of daring. It's not just tagging a wall.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. All those unused billboards alongside the highway. Yeah.
But there's a guy, and so there's some other element. It's not just, I'm going to do this, but I'm going to risk my life and climb up here.
Yeah, well, in that world, you get points, for feats of daring, along with the ability to do certain things with the spray can. It's like you get points for being able to go up on a billboard and do it, and you get double points if you can do it and do it well. Right. Yeah. Yeah. There's a great quote that I didn't mention in the presentation, but one of the resources that I used, there was a great analogy that I read by Cedar Lewis in a book called Street Art, and the comparison was that some people say that they like the really big, expansive stuff, like the stuff I'm promoting, but I hate these messy tags. And there are some people in this world who would say that's like saying, I love jazz, but I just don't like individual notes. That you can't really do the really good stuff without starting here. And then the only other thing I'll say about that is that the other thing that's sort of relevant to this is that in most forms of art, you don't really have to be, you don't see stuff until it's done, right? You only see the finished product. When you go see a symphony, you don't listen in on the practices, right? When you see paintings in the museum, you don't see them at work. One of the things that is sort of a innate feature of this stuff is that you necessarily see people you see their work when they're not quite done. You see amateurs up there alongside with people who actually know what they're doing. So there's a lot of bad graffiti mixed in with good. And when I mean good, I mean like well executed. Yes?
Just curious, how does it work when, say, a building owner agrees to have a mural put up on his property? Is there typically kind of a back and forth as to what they will put up, and do they show them a mock-up?
Yeah.
Does he say, can you put my logo in there?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. In Bushwick, Vang, the guy who, let's see, Bushwick was this one. So the guy that, oh, not that one. Vang, the artist who I interviewed for the book, he does things like this and like that. And then his partners do this sort of thing. Vang told me that when he approached the guy that owns this building, he brought his portfolio and showed him stuff that he had done before, and made the case that if anything you don't like we do, well, we're willing to talk about it. And it varies pretty wildly, I think, from building owner to building owner. This guy was open. This building owner said he was open to anything, literally anything they wanted to do, which not too surprising because that's Bushwick. right? It's yeah, right? Half of it's artsy, half of it's industrial, so that, you know, you're going to have these kinds of owners who are more open to things like that. You know, in places like Staten Island, they're a bit more like, okay, we're in a kind of community that's not going to be real keen on anything goes. And so, you know, you end up with flowers. Oh, that's not it. Sorry. I'm in presenter mode, so it looks different. Yeah, so, you know, you have like flowers and stuff. And it's kind of graffiti-ish. Yeah, but, and I think one of the things that's going to be really interesting is that all of these agreements, they don't really do, people don't do things, you know, they don't write it down. You know, there's no like contracts.
Right.
It's pretty much all handshake agreements. And I mentioned 5 points. That's going to change it all, because they all had handshake agreements, and everything's gone south since they demolished it. And now they're suing the owner. You know, they sued the owner as a result. And so I think going forward, there's going to be fewer handshakes. There's going to be more formalized agreements between the artists and the building owners.
What's the owner of the building supposed to do? I mean, if the building has to be demolished for whatever reason, it's, you know, the property got bought or something, I mean, how are you supposed to preserve
Well,
a
that's
work like that?
that's the big $1 million question at the center of the lawsuit that happened with 5 points. He basically was found to have violated something called VARA, the Visual Arts Reproduction Act. And basically the short of it is that if you give somebody a canvas to do something, and then you are then going to take it away, that's basically what they did, you have to compensate them for it. Or, in that case, at least give them advance notice to do what they can to maybe be able to try to save it in some way, and he didn't do that. So that's an open question as to what, that's when I say that like that's going to have an impact going forward, that's what I mean by that. It's still very much an open question. Yes?
Well, I was actually curious about the whole 5 points thing, because yeah, I agree that it looks nice and stuff, but if I say, or if you come to me and ask me, hey, could I draw on your whiteboard and stuff, I'm like, yeah, I don't really care, I'm not using it anymore. But then I need it later on, I don't really see how you have ownership of what I can do with it.
Right.
So that really surprised me that the owner of the building lost. Because yeah, even with that whole preservation thing you were talking about, that still doesn't really
Right.
seem right for me.
Yeah, I don't know, it's going to be, I think a lot of people were surprised. And some of that was because that law, the VARA statute, had never been tested in that way. It was a new kind of phenomenon. And some of that, I think, is the result of there's becoming more of an understanding that when people give permission to these artists to do what they're going to do, some of them have good intentions, and some of them have, they're a little bit more self-serving. You know, the guy in Jersey City told me point blank, he said, I don't have any money to fix my building. My building's falling down. It's from the 18-something or all that. It's like 100 years old. I need to somehow figure out a way to make more money off my building. I don't have enough money to fix it, but maybe if I have these artists come and paint on my building, then the neighborhood's going to be cool. People will start moving in. I can kick out these tenants that I have who are paying me pennies on the dollar, and I can start to get more money. He was very explicit about that. He made no apologies. He's like, look, I got kids. I got kids in Basking Ridge in school. I gotta find a way. So there's more of an understanding that these things are being used in a way to kind of add value to the property. The guy from 5 Points is exactly the same. He is actually a perfect example of that. I mean, I don't know if you know this, but the building he built to replace it, he tried to trademark the word 5 Points. He took that name of that old building and tried to make, and he was going to have like graffiti inside the building. I mean, he used them. So that's I think what you're seeing is there's more of an understanding that like, look, you're using this for a monetary gain, and you shouldn't just be, yeah, okay, fine, the artists get publicity, but you know, you got to pay more than just publicity.
Do they get paid at all?
Not
I
really.
realize some of these professional groups that get hired.
Some of them do. The Tats crew in the Bronx, they were the ones that did, they didn't do this, but they brought in artists to do this in Hunts Point. That's their business model. They do these ones kind of for fun, and they'll occasionally get supplies. Some of the building owners will hook them up with paint or, you know, ladders and stuff like that. But otherwise, to the extent that they get paid, you know, they just get publicity from it, and then they get hired to do other kinds of signage and
Yeah,
murals
one
and
of the
things like that.
Jersey City guys, I forget which one, I follow him on Instagram, I know he gets paid for it because he's now going all over to
Yeah,
the
yeah,
other states.
yeah. I'm not. I don't know how I feel about that. I mean, I'm all for artists getting paid, obviously. And most of the artists, that's why they do it, because they want to get their names. They want to get some publicity, and eventually get paid in other ways. Most of them are at least the ones I interviewed, were the kinds of people that would go out and do stuff under cover of night illegally, and now they're grown up. You know, they're like me, right? They got kids and stuff, and I don't have a mortgage, but some of them have mortgages. You know, like they can't be out there doing this stuff, risking getting caught. So this is what they do instead of it. So it's a win-win for them. They get to be out there doing the thing that they love, and they also get to get their name out there, and sometimes they get paid too. Yes?
I'm curious about the artists. Did you find that there's a great diversity? I'm thinking of age. Some are self-taught, some have studied art. Any particular predominance of one ethnic group among these artists?
I mean, if there's one thing in common, they're mostly men. Because a lot of them, like I said, came out of the 70s and 80s doing illegal tagging, and that's who was gravitated towards doing that. The ones that I interviewed, very few of them had formal training. I think Vang did. Tats crew certainly did not. Ethnic groups. I didn't interview any women. I didn't get any.
And since the art is so public, and it seems to be in like industrial areas and so forth, do any of the artists have not only the self-expression, what their own imagination is telling them to paint, but any social sense of maybe a message in their art?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, like I said, that's what Neisser was talking about. You know, with I don't have this. There's a picture in the book, but of the stuff going on in Hunts Point. He was very explicit about that. That, like, in particular in the Bronx and in places like Hunts Point, that just having this stuff out there was beneficial.
There's one slide with there was a tall building and the guy seems to be holding a star.
Oh yeah. Well, that's Philadelphia Mural Arts. Yeah.
And I thought of, well, this sort of says hope or
That one.
something.
Yeah, yeah. Philadelphia Mural Arts does things. They are. I think they have something like a 60-step process in place for getting this sort of thing put together. It's not for them. The murals are almost secondary because it brings together all these people in the neighborhood to be involved in it, because they find, they commission real artists to do stuff like this. They find groups that are willing to be caretakers for it, and then they have like endless meetings of the groups and all the different shareholders to come to a consensus of what to do. It's a very much, and they're also supported by the city. They have explicit support from the city. They were started as an anti-graffiti movement. New York doesn't do that, and honestly, I think what they do works for them. I don't think it would work for New York. New York's just too chaotic and big. And it's you have artists. It's as it is. New York works pretty well with regards to the artists and the owners kind of collaborate and work out something on their own what they want. And there are things that are a bit more, this one obviously is a very explicit sort of, you know, it's a little boy holding up a star. Like, it's pretty obvious what that's about. What I tried to make the argument is that even something like this, just by virtue of all the effort and all the time that goes into it, is going to have a really positive effect. Because basically, if you live anywhere near there or you just walk by, you're like, yeah, somebody cares about this place. They really care. Stephen.
You had mentioned reading a scholar of Marx, I guess a Marxist scholar, when you were generating your theoretical framework.
Yeah.
I'm wondering now what you think about the presence of these corporate brands that you see on some of the murals, like in Bushwick, or even people painting, what was it, Rico, which I'm assuming is the,
Yeah, the
the
copier.
corporation.
Yeah.
How do you think that affects the landscape of this, and what kind of effect does it have on?
Well, one of the things that you discover when I mean, this stuff's all over the city, if you know where to go for it. What you find is that the corporatization of it only happens in select areas. So you're not going to see, you know, people showing up to spray paint their company logos on stuff, you know, on walls in Hunts Point. Right, so that I feel like is something that it's not so much the presence of the art, it's more of like who's just in those neighborhoods. Bushwick is obviously a classic example. I mean, I happen to think Bushwick and Williamsburg and Greenpoint have too much of this stuff. It's just, I mean, you're overwhelmed by it. And that's what you see. It's reached a saturation point, and you see these companies who are like, yeah, we can get on this too. And yeah, it does sort of take away from it a little bit. It just, those neighborhoods don't need to be shown really that people are paying attention and caring for it either. They get too much attention. Does that answer your question? Yeah? Yeah. I think, what, you had another question?
Is there a sensitivity about what's called graffiti and what's not? Like, to me, that's not graffiti. Like, when I think of graffiti, I almost think of somebody sprayed their name on a wall. But do they still call this graffiti, or is it just, it's art to me?
Yeah, whether or not something is graffiti, that's another debate. It's a lot like asking whether something's art. Because if you're a purist, you will say, if it was done, and I have heard this, that I shouldn't have been referring to this stuff as graffiti. That if it's not done illegally, it ain't graffiti. I don't think that's ever going to be resolved as a question. It's like how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, right? We can talk about this forever. I based my definitions on kind of generally held perceptions in the wider world, and from the interviews that I talked to people, random people that I talked to, residents, passerbys, things like that. The difference between, to me, it's a question of whether something is graffiti, that is vandalism, right, like a broken window, and it's seen as being something that was done illicitly with kind of devious intentions, or whether it's really obvious where you're like, that's graffiti, done with the same way, done the same tools, you know, same techniques, same people. So why wouldn't you call it? Yes, you guys, man. What?
I was just curious more about the people who do this, and I think you mentioned some of them start with the signatures and they move on to the the murals. I mean, do you have people who sort of come up doing this kind of thing and then branch out into other kinds of art? I mean, is it kind of a way up into the arts profession for some people maybe? I mean, like, what else do they do besides this kind of thing?
Yeah, some of them are actually professional artists. I keep coming back to the guy Veng who did the Bushwick mural. A lot of them, let's see, where are we here, Bushwick? He actually has stopped doing, this guy who does like this, he's actually stopped doing stuff on walls, and he only does things on canvas now. He does pictures of birds, actually, on canvas with oil paints. So there is a lot of overlapping. with in terms of the kind of art that they do. Some of them are very explicit. You know, they're like the Tats crew has made a whole business out of this. Some of them, I think it's just a hobby still. I think about the guy who did this, or he didn't do it, but he organized it, the guy up in Inwood. He worked for the sanitation department. But back in the day, this was what he did under cover of dark. And then he grew up, and he has a job. He can't get arrested, you know, because he loses his job as a sanitation worker. And so this is his way of staying connected to something that he just loves. And so he's worked out deals with a couple of building owners uptown that he and his friends, and he gets to invite other people whose work he loves to come and paint in New York, which is a big deal. There's a great term that I learned when I did this book. It's called a spraycation. There are people who will travel to New York from around the world for the express purpose of doing graffiti here.
Wow.
Because this is where it was born. And so you get your props by being like, yeah, man, I did whatever on a wall in Harlem or something. A couple guys actually just got arrested. I think they were from Italy or Spain. They managed to get into a train yard and did some of the old subway cars and got caught. Yeah, that was just recent. Yes?
So my question is more of the 311 opt-out system, because I'm not really. Well,
do you need to report some graffiti?
Well, no, it's not that, because it's kind of, it sort of feels like it has to be an opt-out because it's illegal to begin with, and you know the city needs to do whatever it is to resolve the issue. So, and I mean, you can have good art that's illegal and bad art that's legal.
Right.
So it's not really a question of whether it's art or not.
Right.
And it seems like you can't. I mean, as much as I'd like for the third-party thing, I don't know how the connect with the graffiti artist and the business owner would work, because it'd mean that the graffiti artist would have to reveal their identity, which means until the business owner says, no, I'm actually okay with it,
right,
it's illegal. So I'm wondering what the workaround would be for that.
Well, the workaround for me, in my mind, would be that you could open it up to the kinds of people who already do this kind of thing. So they are already willing to reveal their identities. They work with the building owners. There already are people out there who are willing to do this. And to my, you know, this was something that I imagined in my head, you know. I don't know how it would work in practice. I will say that the experience of the 100 Gates folks is very instructive, right? Because they're doing it on a small scale. When I first heard about what they're doing, and this is a business improvement district, so it's a very small quadrant of the city, that to me was like, oh my, you know, this is perfect. And to some extent, it is working well because they've already expanded into two more neighborhoods. And so they work very closely one-on-one with the building owners, you know, and the artists, and they connect them, and they work out what they're going to do. So they're kind of a good example of one way they could do it, if you wanted to expand it to a citywide way of doing it. One of the things that happened towards the end, after the book had come out, actually, is I then found the woman who did 100 Gates. I didn't know that they were doing it when I first worked on the book. And she and I connected, and she knew somebody from the EDC. And he was very excited about possibly taking what the Lower East Side Business District was doing and expanding it citywide. And I actually was supposed to meet with him, and we had a meeting all set up. I went downtown to his office, and he had to cancel because his office had bed bugs. And then the follow-up never happened, and then he left. And so the whole thing fell apart. And so that would be a good way to kind of make that work. But I mean, to me, the whole thing is that there's just no real interest in adding this other possibility beyond just buffing or leaving up tags. So.
Because I do actually find these to be really intricate and nice.
Yeah. Are we?
Yeah, we're on the clock, yeah.
All right. Thank you, everybody.